I'm Cliff Ribner, and I want to talk to you today about administrative agencies, these things that have been set up. The first one actually was the Agriculture Department. It set up in 1862, and it had no power over the citizens at that time. The first one that actually had power to do what all of them do now, which is tell people what to do. They literally order people around, order people and businesses. And the first one that could do that was the Interstate Commerce Commission, set up in 1887. And what that one was all about was the railroads. And by the way, the whole basis for this kind of structure, it was the one who really was the mastermind of setting these things up first in the Western world. The Chinese had them. It's called administrative agencies. Anyway, the first one to really do it effectively was Louis XIV. Louis XIV wanted to have absolute power over France. Technically, he did. That's the way kings were in Europe at that time. They either had absolute power or they didn't. And they could literally tell anybody to do anything. They could make their own laws. The one place that was different from that was the UK, Britain. Britain was the one country where, beginning in the 14th century, people, the people other than the king had been extracting power from the central authority and giving it to themselves. And they were given originally under Magna Carta, they extracted the power to really own property. But the king, because he could do anything, could take anybody's property. He didn't even have to give an excuse. They set up that it could only be taken but with due process, and people had to be paid for it. And when people owned property, they really owned it. It's called fee simple absolute. And under that, your home is your castle. At that time, barons were the only, noblemen were the only ones who actually owned property. Everyone else was a serf because the Normans had conquered England and imposed serfdom on the English. But that was disappearing very rapidly. And over time, and the other thing that Magna Carta did was it said the king couldn't have taxes or laws without Parliament passing them. He couldn't pass his own laws. And over time, what always happens is the central authority tries to extract power back for itself. Power in the state is a zero-sum game between the central authority and the citizens. To the extent that the central authority has it, the citizens don't. So that every drop of power that's taken from the citizens is given to the central authority. And what's terrible about these bureaucracies, the nature of bureaucracy is it's a centralized, power-grabbing entity. That's what it is. And it's always seeking, it's like a cancer. Each one of these things, they are themselves, it's part of collectivism. Collectivism is when the central power directs everything that goes on in society. Collectivists pretend communism is the most common form of collectivism in our time, communism and socialism. And what it is, it's when they claim that the community, or rather the nation, is more important than the individual. And to the extent that happens, the individual loses all his power and all his rights. And what these agencies do is they police us. This, as I was saying, the first one that was set up that actually policed us was the Interstate Commerce Commission. The reason that was set up is the railroad was an incredible invention. Prior to the railroad, the only way you could move heavy stuff was by ox cart or horse-drawn carriage. That was literally the technology that it replaced. And it was transformative. It's like the difference between an airplane and a bicycle. And it also made it possible for people to be transported in a safe manner, relatively safe, across the country. There were all sorts of potential dangers in traveling across the country. Like Indians would kill people, bandits would attack trains from time to time. There were bandits who did that, particularly after the Civil War. But there really weren't any trains until the Civil War. But anyway, the people that owned the railroads, and the way the railroads were established very quickly, first of all, there was the technology, which kept improving. Trains kept being able to go faster and carry heavier loads. And the technology was, as the technology improved, trains were also able to charge less and less. This is what happens in a free market. As things get better, they also get cheaper. Think about all the products you have today. Don't think about the stuff in your kitchen. All the labor-saving devices in the kitchen, washing machines, dishwashers, they've all been ruined by regulations that the federal government has been putting out supposedly to save water and to save the environment. Now, these things are nonsense on their face for multiple reasons. First of all, there's a certain amount of water on the planet. It doesn't disappear just because you use it. It stays on the planet. It gets moved around. And anyway, all of these things for environmental purposes, they started ruining all the stuff that is labor-saving devices beginning in the George H.W. Bush administration. But some of it goes back to the Carter administration. The automobile has been completely affected by this. Anyway, let me tell you about the Interstate Commerce Commission, because it was the first one, and the structure of it, the way it exerts power over the railroad. It was intended to basically to tell the railroads how much they could charge, because they pretended that the government could get involved in the market. In every market, you have a seller and a buyer, and the seller is only able to charge what the buyer wants to pay. The seller is either going to make a profit that way or go out of business. Each side gets a profit. That's how markets operate. And what happens is, over time, products improve and prices go down. The best way to see this is with things that you have in your house, where the prices have really gone down. TVs, that's a good example. Even though we could have had the kind of TVs we have today 50 years ago, they still have kept improving and improving. What it is the federal government, the FCC, got involved basically in dictating what kind of TVs we could buy. And the federal government has been involved dictating all manners of communication. Communication is one of the most important things in the economy, and there's various types of communication. There's the telephone, and the railroad was the first. It's a type of communication where it transports people and goods from place to place. But the reason they were able to and this was a new type of law. We never had any laws in America prior to that dictating how businesses operate. And this was a feature of European law. Louis XIV started it. He was the one who did it in the most aggressive and actually successful manner. All the other kings in Europe tried to imitate him. And he was a complete tyrant. As a child, France was very unstable prior to his kingdom. The nobility were actually at war with the king at times. And when Louis XIV was a child, he became king because his father died. And the kingship was very weak at that point. There was a regency, and Louis and his brother and his mother had to flee Paris. The nobles who were fighting the king, basically it stirred up a mob in France, and they barely got out with their lives. His mother had to sell jewels for them to eat. It was really quite extraordinary. And one of the things he wanted to be able to do was treat France the way a victor in war would treat a defeated enemy. And the way he did that was with these bureaucracies. That's what the bureaucracies do. They treat all the people under their thumb like the defeated enemy in a war, who they've got total power over. And the Interstate Commerce Commission just had power over the railroads. It happens that the American railroads, at that time, the owners of them didn't fight it. And there was really no opposition to it, which is how it passed, because everybody knew it was unconstitutional. There's nothing in the Constitution that permits the federal government to get involved, sticking its nose into the operations of any business at all. They've been pretending that the Interstate Commerce Clause of Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution permits it, but it definitely does not. And we know that there was one Supreme Court case in the 19th century, the opinions written by Chief Justice Marshall. He makes it very clear in the syllabus of the case that clause does not apply to things like having to do with health and safety. And health and safety have always been the excuse for these bureaucracies. They claim they're doing something that's going to improve our health or our safety or make things cheaper. He said it's very clear, it's right. He knew. He was one of the founders, and there's other reasons why we know. James Madison, who was the principal author of the Constitution, as president, did a veto message when Congress passed a law using money that it wasn't a tax. The federal government had obtained money, and they wanted to use it for what they called internal improvements. These are things like bridges and canals, and they passed a law for this. James Madison vetoed it. He said it was unconstitutional, and there was nothing in the Interstate Commerce Clause that permitted it. And you can read his veto message. He also wrote one of the Federalist Papers, Federalist 42, or I think it's 46 on this subject. It's either 42 or 46 on this subject, where he makes very clear that the purpose of that clause was to deal with a very specific situation which had arisen prior to the Constitution, when there was the Articles of Confederation, essentially just a treaty between the 13 colonies and then the 13 states. It was a little more than a typical treaty, but that's really all it was. And they could vote on various things. But what happened was individual states would bully businesses from other states. They tried to hit them with taxes, all sorts of stuff. And what James Madison says in that Federalist is the purpose of the clause was basically to preserve the rights of those businesses from being punished by states, from being bullied by states. Because the single most important thing in this country, as recognized by all the founders, were businesses. That's what they meant in the Declaration of Independence, when they said they were fighting for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It wasn't just, the right to have fun with your friends on the weekend. It was about the pursuit, that's the word, the pursuit of wealth through having a business, the trade or business of your choice, and operating it. That considered such a fundamental right that they were fighting the revolution against the greatest power in the world for that. And it was recognized that the way these men looked at Europe, and they could see which countries were getting richer and more powerful. And the more freedom businesses had in each country to operate, the wealthier the country became, and of course the freer the people were. The less the king was sticking his nose into things. France remained poorer than Britain because Britain had freer rights over the business. The entire wealth of the Netherlands was based on the freedom of businesses to operate. Even in places like Italy, the way the Venetians and the Florentines became rich was from business. It doesn't happen just because the king decides he's going to get involved in the business. In fact, that always made people poorer and less free, and they recognized that. And they wanted us to be the freest people in the world, and the last thing they wanted was the government getting involved in telling businesses how to run their business. We already had two things controlling how businesses operated, making sure that they only did good for both themselves and everyone else. The laws of the marketplace and the common law. The common law has its own rules for governing what people can do in a business context. Laws against fraud, for example. We don't need agencies to police businesses about fraud. That's all the SEC does, by the way. Anyway, the Interstate Commerce Commission was created supposedly to enhance the safety and health and pricing decency of railroads. And in the Carter administration, they did a detailed study of the Interstate Commerce Commission, and they came up with the conclusion in 1978, which is about 100 years after it was formed, the whole thing was absolutely worthless. And the structure of it, the reason that the business owners wanted to go along with it and didn't fight it was first of all, they were very rich and they were arrogant. They were confident that they could figure out a way to control the politicians, who in turn, at least in theory, would have control over the bureaucrats at the agency. So it would be in their pocket to that extent. Plus, the fact that the government would get involved in the market meant that it was going to restrict the ability of newcomers to come into the market and compete with them. The way you can think about it is, what happens if there's a referee in a basketball game who cheats, who favors one side over the other? He was a bully. Well, it doesn't help the game, it ruins the game, and it corrupts the game. And that's exactly what happens when the government gets involved. It's a bully in the marketplace. It has no market power. All of the participants in the market, they each have market power it is a wonderful thing. It's it's the definition of what people have that other people want. It's the power that other people desire for their stuff. It's the power someone has when someone else desires their goods or services enough to pay for them. That's what your market power is. And this is true for everyone. Everyone has market power. Employees have market power. We don't need the government telling employers how to treat employees. And in fact, we have agencies who do things like police the stock market. That's what the SEC does. And particularly, we've got them for banks. That's ever since 1913, when the Fed was created. It monopolized the currency. Completely unconstitutional. It prints money. It's not allowed. The federal government is actually not allowed to print money. It's right in the Constitution, in Article 1, Section 8. It's given the power to coin money. So every dollar it prints, it's counterfeit. And there's only 2 crimes the federal government's is actually allowed to enforce, to investigate and to enforce. It's specified in Article 1, Section 8. Counterfeiting is one of them. The other one is piracy, but only piracy on the high seas. The pirates come into Savannah and start shaking people down if they want to walk down the street. That's a Georgia problem. They did not want the federal government policing the citizens. They didn't want the government being a tyrant telling us how to live our lives and using things like criminal laws to police us. And that's what all those agencies do. The way they operate is they make their own laws. That's a violation of Article 1 of the Constitution. The very first words after the preamble of the Constitution is all legislative power, all, shall be in the Congress. Only Congress is allowed to make laws. And the Constitution has very specific procedures for how they're made. And none of those regulations qualify. In fact, they've turned the whole process on its head. That's a whole lecture by itself. But what they do is they create laws and they act like a court. Because only under our system, only courts are allowed to order citizens to do anything. And that's what those agencies do. They order people to do things. And each one has a particular sphere where it has jurisdiction. There are the employment ones, things like the Labor Department, created under the Wagner Act, the NLRB. They get involved in all labor contracts so that employees and employers there's this bully involved in the game between employers and employees. And then they basically promote unions. And unions also collectivize things. And the union itself is a collectivist entity. It's a bureaucracy by itself. So it's policing the whole market along with the government. The fact that the unelected, nobody elected the union members or the union officials other than the union members. The rest of us didn't, but we're all affected by it. So since it gets involved, it violates the guarantee clause. It's not part of the government, but it gets involved in a quasi-governmental way. And this is particularly bad for public employee unions, where they get involved in a quasi-governmental way in the government itself. And of course, all the union dues, where do they go? They go to one party. So you have party officials from the Democrat Party negotiating with union members who put them in office. What kind of a deal do you think that is for the taxpayers who are not involved in the negotiation? That tells you right there how it violates the Constitution, and it's completely corrupt. No one is supposed to have power in a Republican form of government, which we are guaranteed in the Constitution, other than people that are either elected or appointed by elected officials and supervised by them, other than courts. Now, the judges are appointed by elected officials, but once they're in operation, there's minimal control over them by anybody. They can be impeached under certain circumstances, but that's what it takes. It's the same rules for impeachment of judges as there are for presidents. And what we have is that all of these agencies have all 3 powers of government. In the Federalist 47, Madison, quoting Montesquieu, said that the combination of all 3 powers of the government, legislative, executive, and judicial, is, quote unquote, the very definition of tyranny. And he guaranteed that we would never have that. But that's what we have in every one of those agencies. So they write their own laws. They order people around like courts. The judicial branch is the only one that's allowed to make orders to people. And that's all those agencies do. In fact, it's so bad. Right now, when we have a shutdown, because these agencies have been set up to require their permission in order for businesses to do all sorts of things, like use their land. They can't drill a well without getting permission from the government. That's never supposed to happen in America. Never. It's supposed to be your land, and if you want to drill on it, you can drill on it. And only if you're going to create a nuisance can your neighbor tell you something about it. But the government can't, and other people can't sue you. They pass these environmental laws permitting people who don't have any connection to the land at all to stop the owner from using his own land. It's absolutely crazy, and it's totally unconstitutional. All those laws are unconstitutional. So you have hundreds of these agencies with millions of employees. And of course, the public employee unions, they're never happy with, they always want more and more government employees who get to pay dues and be part of their union. Most of the government employees are, at least in the federal government, a big chunk of them are in the union. And they all have to get involved with the union whether they want to or not. And it's very hard to get rid of these unions once they're established. They've also passed laws to do that. The Wagner Act, most of the unions we have in what they call the private sector, only about 6% of the employees are in union shops and have a union, which tells you how much employees actually want them. They don't really help the employees at all. In fact, they hurt. At one time, arguably they were beneficial to the employees. But what they did also, they were very racist. They used to prevent black people from being in the union. So they prevented things like the electricians union. Black people weren't allowed. So they couldn't become an electrician. This is one of the things the unions would do. They would monopolize all the employment in a particular business. And they're part of this whole corrupt thing with these agencies, because the unions couldn't exist without the laws passed by the agency under the Wagner Act, which is itself unconstitutional. I'm Cliff Ribner, and I hope you like this video, and if you do, show that you like it, and tell your friends about it, and go to my website, cliffordribner.com, and read my book, Freedom's Last Stand. Thank you.